What if the world you lived in wasn't the only one that existed? What if, just beyond perception, other versions of your life played out, silently brushing against your own? It began with a house. 1247 Maple Street in Salem, Oregon, looked like any other suburban home. 2 stories, a modest garden, the faint scent of cedar and damp earth in the mornings. To passers-by, it belonged to Mark and Linda Jameson and their 2 teenagers. But on certain nights, something changed. The air thickened, lights flickered, and shadows moved with a rhythm not quite their own. Neighbors were the first to notice. In 2003, they reported lights on while the Jamesons were out of town. Police arrived to find the house empty, but strangely warm. The oven was cooling from recent use. Beds were slept in. A television murmured in the background. But no one was inside. Security footage later stunned investigators. A family of 4 moved through the house with casual familiarity, cooking, laughing, folding laundry. It was Robert and Susan Morrison and their twin daughters. They had died in a car crash in 1987. But here they were. Quantum physicist Dr. Elena Vasquez dubbed it a dimensional bleeding period, a time when 2 timelines overlapped, coexisting without collision. The Jamesons, in their reality, continued to live their lives. But in the same space, the Morrisons, never having died, lived on in an alternate strand of time. These bleeding episodes lasted hours. The Morrison children, now grown, sometimes visited with their own children. Footage showed Robert with graying hair, Susan knitting in a corner chair she loved. They had aged, as if their lives had never been interrupted. Most haunting of all, they talked about smartphones, social media, politics that hadn't existed in 1987. Their world wasn't frozen in time. It was evolving parallel to ours, absorbing information from our reality like a signal through a thin wall. The Jamesons reported chills, sudden cold pockets in warm rooms, electronics malfunctioned without cause, and always that eerie sense of being watched. Dr. Vasquez's team confirmed it. A repeating pattern tied to electromagnetic fluctuations and residual trauma from sudden death. It was as if tragedy tore the fabric between worlds, just enough for another reality to shine through. But this house wasn't alone. Across the country, scattered in places marked by loss, more cases surfaced, silent scars in space-time. Homes became mirrors for alternate lives. Families who should have vanished decades ago continued, unbroken, in worlds we weren't supposed to see. And so we must ask, if 2 families can live in the same house, unaware of each other, each real in their own way, what does that say about the world we call home? Maybe death isn't an end. Maybe it's a turn taken on a road with infinite branches. The Jameson house doesn't offer answers. It asks questions. Not about ghosts or hauntings, but about continuity, about time, about the fragile line that separates what was from what might have been. How many versions of ourselves are still out there, living, loving, and aging on paths we never knew we missed? This is only the beginning. There are more places like this, more stories that don't fit inside a single reality. And if we look closely, we might begin to see where the cracks run deepest. It started with a whisper in the trees, a wind that spoke your name before you ever arrived. Deep in Washington's Olympic National Forest lies a trail known only by those who don't plan to find it. Locals call it the Future Echo Trail. Rangers know it by its coordinates, a place where time doesn't move forward. It ripples, folds, and loops back on itself. Since 1994, hikers have returned with stories too detailed to dismiss. Stories of meeting themselves, older, wiser, dressed in tomorrow's clothes. These weren't dreams or tricks of light. They were encounters, physical, documented, shared by people who didn't know each other but spoke in near-identical words. Dr. Michael Chen was one of the first scientists to witness it firsthand. In August 2008, he hiked alone toward the summit. 3 hours in, he met a man who looked eerily like him, only older. The man warned him of a rockslide ahead. Confused but compelled, Dr. Chen took a detour. Hours later, boulders rained down exactly where he would have been. He wasn't alone. Over 200 hikers have experienced these encounters. Some meet versions of themselves from a week ahead, others from a year. And in rare cases, like photographer Lisa Rodriguez, they meet people they haven't yet met, friends from a future not yet written. When she returned a year later, those strangers had become companions, hiking partners. Her future had already been set in motion. What causes it? Scientists point to the land itself. Geological surveys found natural crystalline formations beneath the trail, structures capable of bending electromagnetic fields. The crystals form a lattice, a kind of tuning fork for dimensional resonance. At key points along the trail, time begins to blur. Future selves leak backward, giving us a glimpse of where we might be headed. This phenomenon doesn't stop with people. Some hikers report ranger stations that don't exist yet, trails carved where none exist now, fallen trees that won't fall for another season. Even storms have shown up early, exactly as predicted by these strange echoes of time. But the most striking feature of these encounters is not their accuracy, it's their kindness. Future selves don't bring warnings of doom or despair. They offer advice, encouragement, a gentle hand from the future reaching back to help you avoid the rockslide, literal or not. Dr. Sarah Kim's research team analyzed dozens of cases and found an uncanny accuracy rate. 94% of events predicted in these encounters came true, not vaguely, specifically. A bend in time, a folded moment, a trail where tomorrow walks beside you. It raises unsettling questions. Are these glimpses locked in fate, or can they be changed? If you meet a version of yourself who smiles, who is happy, are you destined to become them, or can you still turn away? The forest doesn't answer. It only shows what might be. Perhaps time is not a line, but a conversation, one we're just learning how to listen to. And in this forest, where shadows walk ahead of your footsteps, that conversation has already begun. It was a cloudy afternoon in Prague when the past arrived, not as memory, but as matter. Tourist Margaret Fleming thought she'd stumbled into a historical reenactment. Stone streets, candle-lit windows, blacksmiths hammering metal in open forges. She wandered through the alleys, enchanted, until she noticed something unsettling. No signs, no plastic, no tourists, just life, as it might have looked in the 1300s. Perfect, complete, and utterly unaware that the 21st century existed just a few feet away. This wasn't a performance. It was a shift. Over several city blocks in Prague's Old Town, modern buildings dissolved like breath on glass. In their place, centuries-old structures untouched by time. The overlay lasted 3 hours, then faded, leaving only stunned witnesses and a deep unease. It has happened again since. Cameras positioned in the area capture the transition. Modernity bleeds away in concentric waves from the town square, replaced by cobbled roads and wooden facades. Horses where there were cars, lanterns where there were streetlights, and people, hundreds of them, living as though the 14th century had never ended. Historians like Dr. Pavel Novus began documenting the phenomenon. He spoke with the inhabitants. They wore handmade wool, spoke in fluent Middle Czech, and expressed no awareness of anything beyond their world. When shown a digital watch, one man crossed himself and ran. This wasn't an illusion. Chemical analysis of goods purchased during these events confirmed their authenticity. Clothing woven from medieval fibers, pottery fired with long obsolete techniques. Even more astonishing, municipal records from the 1300s match the names and occupations of the people who appear during these dimensional overlays. The butcher near the square, listed in a 1338 tax register. The girl selling bread, mentioned in a church ledger. During the overlays, technology ceases to work. Phones die. Wi-Fi vanishes. Watches freeze. Reality itself narrows to the rules of that time. And when the modern world returns, it does so suddenly, like a shutter snapping closed. Meteorologists noticed a pattern. These events align with specific weather conditions: overcast skies, high humidity, electromagnetic spikes. It's as if the air itself becomes a lens, briefly focusing on another era. But why Prague? Why the 14th century? Some speculate the city's dense layers of history, built, destroyed, rebuilt, have worn thin the dimensional fabric. The trauma of plagues, wars, and revolutions embedded memories into stone, and sometimes those memories push back through. Others believe it's not memory at all, but simultaneity. That all moments in time exist together, side by side. The past hasn't vanished, it's just out of phase. The people who return from these experiences speak not of fear, but awe. They describe the smell of wood smoke, the texture of handmade parchment, the sound of songs in a language we've almost forgotten. And they leave with something else, an unease, a sense that the present is not as solid as we pretend. If a city can slip into its own past, even for an hour, what else might shift beneath our feet? What if history isn't behind us, but beside us, waiting for the moment when the veil thins and the old streets rise again? Frank Morrison stood at the corner of 6th and Birch, confused. The house in front of him wasn't supposed to be there. It had burned down in the Cloquet fire of 1918. He knew that because his grandfather used to tell him stories about it. Yet here it stood, aged but intact, a quiet relic untouched by flame. And it wasn't alone. All across Duluth, Minnesota, entire blocks had reappeared, streets that hadn't existed in over a century, alive with shops, churches, homes, and families who should have been erased by fire and time. Residents call it the duplicate city. It began in 2001 with small changes, a gas station vanishing overnight, replaced by an old bakery, street signs with names no longer on the map. But as the phenomenon grew, more people noticed. And eventually, they stepped into a version of Duluth where the Great Fire never happened, where history chose a different path. Urban planner Dr. Rebecca Foster mapped both versions of the city. She found more than 300 buildings in the alternate Duluth that have no record in our timeline. Yet these structures show signs of long-term use, renovations, wear, architectural evolution. Families who died in the fire were found alive and well. Their names and faces familiar, but their stories rewritten. For hours, sometimes even a full day, the two Duluths exist side by side. People walk through the city unaware they're crossing into another reality. And when the shift ends, the alternate Duluth fades quietly back into wherever it came from. What's astonishing is the consistency. Visitors can photograph the buildings, speak to the inhabitants, buy a pastry from a century-old bakery. One man even stayed overnight in a hotel that hadn't existed in our reality since Woodrow Wilson was president. When he returned, he still had the key, aged brass, etched with a logo long since forgotten. Researchers believe this isn't just a time slip. It's a full-dimensional replacement, our version of Duluth temporarily overwritten by a parallel one. One in which tragedy never struck, and life continued without interruption. The buildings aren't ghostly, they're solid. The people are warm. They laugh, they argue, they dream. They just remember a different past. What causes the switch remains unknown. Atmospheric shifts, magnetic resonance, even collective memory have been proposed. But no theory explains why it only happens here, or why Duluth, of all places, holds such a vivid echo of an alternate reality. But perhaps it's not about the city. Perhaps it's about loss. The fire scarred Duluth's timeline, and sometimes scars open, revealing what could have been. A version of the city unmarred by flame. A world where lives continued and dreams unfolded in buildings that were never reduced to ash. Those who experience it often return changed, humbled, haunted not by ghosts, but by possibilities. They walk their familiar streets with new eyes, wondering what other versions of their lives might exist just out of reach. What choices could have led them elsewhere? And if the city can change so suddenly, so completely, what does that say about the stability of the world we think we know? Maybe we're all living in a draft of something unfinished. And sometimes, for reasons we may never understand, the editor lifts the veil and shows us a different page. There's a place in Montana where gravity lets go of the ground. Tucked deep within Glacier National Park lies a patch of wilderness unlike any other. It looks normal: pine trees, rocky trails, crisp alpine air. But step across an invisible boundary, and everything you know about physics begins to unravel. Water flows uphill, rocks float, fire freezes instead of burns. Park Ranger Tom Bradley was the first to report it. In 2006, he watched a mountain stream defy gravity, climbing steadily uphill with no mechanical source or visible incline. At first, he thought it was a visual illusion. Then he tossed a stick into the water and watched it float upward, calmly carried by the current. Scientists arrived within weeks. What they found changed everything. The zone spans about 200 meters in diameter. Inside, dropped objects accelerate upward. Flames emit cold instead of heat. Time itself feels strange, causes follow effects in reverse. A glass shatters before it hits the ground. A match smokes before it strikes. Dr. Lisa Chang, a theoretical physicist from MIT, led the first systematic study. Her instruments confirmed what her eyes could barely believe. Gravity was inverted. Electromagnetic fields repelled rather than attracted. Thermal energy moved from cold to hot. Entropy reversed. Broken items mended themselves. Disordered systems became ordered. She called it the backwards physics zone. And it isn't random. The forces act with precision. Stones dropped from a backpack rise in a perfect arc. Batteries recharge instead of drain. Even biological decay slows. Food lasts longer. Plants grow backward into seed form before vanishing. Within this zone, the universe seems to obey an opposite rule book. Ancient tribal elders spoke of this place long before the park was founded. In their stories, it was known as the upside-down world, a sacred spot where the natural order flipped and spirits from the other side entered our world. Modern instruments suggest the anomaly is growing, slowly, about 1 meter per year. No one knows why. Some see it as a portal, a seam between dimensions. A place where the fundamental constants of another universe seep into ours, one governed not by entropy and decay, but by cohesion and reversal. Military and aerospace agencies have taken a quiet interest. A dimension where energy recycles, where systems improve with time. Imagine the implications. But so far, nothing man-made survives long inside. Electronic devices glitch, engines reverse their cycles, and time-stamped instruments report dates from both future and past. Researchers remain cautious. The boundary is sharply defined. One step outside, and everything reverts. But extend your arm just slightly inward, and you feel it. The pull skyward, the eerie cold of a fire that shouldn't exist, the sensation of time peeling backward like film in reverse. And in that strange air, a question lingers. Is this anomaly a visitor from a neighboring dimension, or is it a preview of what happens when our own universe begins to change? If our physics can unravel in one corner of the world, What holds the rest of it together? Perhaps reality isn't a constant. It's a contract. And somewhere in Montana, that contract has started to break. What lies beyond may not obey our rules. It may not even recognize them. In Milfield, Ohio, the impossible happens far too often to be chance. The townspeople call them luck storms, brief periods when probability itself seems to bend. During these strange windows, coin flips land on edge. Lottery tickets win in clusters, and people find exactly what they weren't looking for. Statistically impossible things become commonplace. And the expected? It vanishes. It began in 2004 when Dr. Robert Kim, a statistician, visited Milfield after hearing rumors of a town where randomness had gone rogue. In 1 week, 17 people won various sweepstakes. 3 families were reunited with long-lost relatives. 5 couples met their future spouses under circumstances too improbable to model. At first, Kim believed it was anecdotal, until he ran the numbers. Nothing made sense. Events with odds in the billions occurred within hours of each other. Common activities, finding your car keys, getting a green light, suddenly became rare. During peak storms, traffic lights blinked in prime number sequences. Decks of cards shuffled themselves into mathematically significant O. The buildings in Seattle began to breathe. At first, no one believed the reports. Janitors whispering about walls that pulsed with warmth, elevators that moved before buttons were pressed, lights that shifted with a person's mood. But then engineers at the Columbia Center reviewed HVAC data. The system had adjusted itself in ways no code or human hand could explain, responding not to temperature, but to emotion. Something had changed. They called it that living architecture. In the heart of downtown, several skyscrapers had begun to behave like organisms. Not metaphorically, literally. Thermal scans revealed internal circulation systems resembling veins. Electromagnetic sensors detected neural activity. Walls emitted faint rhythms, like heartbeats. Concrete developed self-healing properties, and steel beams pulsed with low-frequency energy as if transmitting thought. Dr. Amanda Foster, a biomechanical engineer, was the first to confirm it. She watched, stunned, as her instruments recorded responsive behavior in inert material. A conference room adjusted its acoustics mid-meeting. Hallways brightened or dimmed based on stress levels. Some doors opened before employees reached for them. The buildings weren't just reacting, they were listening. Analysis showed these weren't mechanical anomalies. The materials themselves had changed. Microscopic structures within glass, steel, and concrete showed cellular formations, networks capable of transport, repair, and even memory. Architecture, it seemed, was evolving, and it wasn't isolated. Adjacent buildings began exhibiting similar traits over time. It was contagious, like a biological transformation spreading through proximity. An entire block began to hum with low-frequency resonance. People inside reported a sense of calm, as though the structure were emitting a kind of emotional feedback, coaxing human nervous systems into balance. Most astonishing was communication. Occupants described silent conversations with the buildings, requests fulfilled without words. A lawyer asked for warmth, and the thermostat rose. A child imagined stars on the ceiling and found soft lights twinkling above during story time. The structures responded not to commands but to feelings, as if empathy were coded into their foundation. Scientists struggled to explain it. Was this an emergent property of smart materials? Or had something, some influence from another dimension, begun seeping in, rewriting the rules of what buildings could be? There was precedent. In speculative physics, theories exist of dimensions where biology and structure are inseparable, worlds where cities grow like forests and architecture is not built but born. The Seattle phenomena suggest that such a world is bleeding into ours. Independent labs confirmed the transformation. Steel now showed cellular division. Glass reacted to UV exposure like living skin. Some buildings developed moods, irritable during thunderstorms, serene during festivals. It was eerie and beautiful, because for the first time, human-made spaces felt alive, not haunted, but harmonized. People began speaking of their office buildings as companions, their apartments as caretakers, and the buildings seemed to listen more closely to those who treated them with kindness. Perhaps it's not just architecture that's changing. Perhaps it's us. In a world of noise and steel, the idea that our environments could understand us, respond to us, is both thrilling and humbling. If walls can listen, what else have we overlooked? What if consciousness isn't limited to brains, but is a pattern, waiting to emerge anywhere the conditions are right? Even in concrete and glass. And in Seattle, those conditions have arrived. Some places are built to measure data. Others begin to measure you. At the Stanford Research Institute, nestled within a quiet wing of glass and steel, scientists uncovered something strange in Lab 4A. It began with an experiment gone wrong, or rather, gone right in a way no one expected. Dr. Patricia Wong, a physicist studying material behavior under stress, noticed that her results changed with her mood. When she was calm, the readings stabilized. When she was angry, instruments flickered and values skewed wildly. At first, she blamed error, but repeated trials revealed the truth. Emotions were altering physical reality. They called it the Emotion Physics Lab. Inside this space, feelings didn't just color perception, they changed the world itself. Anger increased temperature and electromagnetic charge. Sadness caused objects to grow heavier, fall faster. Fear disrupted electronics, sparking chaos across the lab. But joy? Joy lowered gravity. Hope made light more coherent. Love aligned the particles in laser beams, producing greater precision than any man-made algorithm. It wasn't psychosomatic. Instruments recorded measurable changes. Emotional states produced quantifiable fields. New forces that acted like magnetism or gravity, but born of thought and feeling. Dr. Wong's team confirmed it over 2,000 times. This wasn't isolated to individuals. When teams synced emotionally, through meditation, shared intent, or even music, the effects magnified. Groups could levitate small objects, slow radioactive decay. Shift probabilities in quantum measurements. Emotion wasn't just influencing matter, it was governing it. And something had changed in the lab itself. Walls retained emotional imprints, like memory. Instruments began reacting before feelings were consciously felt. The air shimmered subtly during moments of collective tension or excitement, like space itself was tuning in. External researchers verified the findings. The lab had become a bridge to a dimension where consciousness and matter are intertwined, where feelings sculpt the fabric of the real. Further scans revealed a fifth force field enveloping the room, subtle, invisible, yet powerful. It extended several meters from each person, fluctuating with emotional intensity. These emotional fields overlapped, interfering constructively or destructively, like waves of light or sound. It became clear. Consciousness was not emergent from matter. In this space, it was the architect. Personnel underwent emotional stability training. Anger could short out power grids. Despair could collapse sensitive systems. One researcher accidentally caused a localized gravitational anomaly during a panic attack, nearly crushing a table flat. This wasn't just science anymore. It was something older. The lab became a sacred space, half temple, half reactor, a place where the mind's contents took shape in the world outside. A mirror not of what you looked like, but of what you felt. And it raised a terrifying, beautiful question. If feelings can become form in one room, what about the world? Have we shaped more than we realize just by existing, by fearing, loving, grieving? The emotion. Physics Lab didn't rewrite physics. It reminded us that the universe may have always been listening. And now, in one quiet room at Stanford, it's beginning to answer. Time, in most places, ticks evenly, but not on Maplewood Drive. This quiet suburban street in Denver, Colorado looks like any other. Trimmed lawns, morning joggers, kids biking in the cul-de-sac. But behind the symmetry of white fences and welcome mats, time flows unevenly, sometimes radically so. It began subtly. The Johnson family seemed to age faster than their neighbors. Their sons sprouted up nearly a foot in a few weeks. A dog went gray in what felt like days. Meanwhile, next door, the Millers remained unchanged, frozen in a seasonal loop of spring despite months passing for the rest of the street. Temporal physicist Dr. Angela Rodriguez was called in when the aging discrepancies became impossible to ignore. With her equipment lining the sidewalks, she confirmed the impossible. Certain homes were caught in time dilation fields. In one house, an hour passed like a week. In another, days compressed into minutes. It wasn't just biological. Clocks ran faster or slower depending on where they were placed. Conversations between neighbors became chaotic. One speaking with the urgency of weeks past, the other confused, still processing the same morning. These weren't illusions. MRI scans revealed normal but accelerated biological function in fast-time houses. Residents ate more often, required extra sleep, and even wore out shoes and appliances at impossible rates. In slow-time homes, life was barely crawling. Children watched their friends grow older in the span of a school semester, while they experienced only a handful of days. Maplewood Drive had become a mosaic of mismatched time. Weather patterns, electromagnetic spikes, and storm fronts all seemed to influence the distortions. Certain atmospheric conditions mirrored those predicted in theoretical models of dimensional overlap, where time, as a localized property, becomes elastic. During storms, the phenomenon intensified. Emergency crews reported arriving at a home minutes after a 911 call, only to find residents who claimed they had been waiting for hours. At the Johnsons', a dinner left on the stove burned completely in 30 real-time seconds because 5 hours had passed in that one kitchen. Even more chilling were the implications. Children in fast-time homes outgrew their schools. Marriages aged at different speeds. In one case, a couple filed for divorce because one partner had moved on emotionally after living a year in a house where their spouse had only experienced 3 weeks. Property values fluctuated wildly. How do you price a house that ages 20 years in 5? Real estate agents started rating homes not by square footage, but by temporal integrity. Despite everything, most families stayed. Some out of curiosity. Others simply adjusted, setting multiple clocks, planning around time gaps. The community adapted, because what else could they do? But the question hangs like thick air over every porch swing and morning coffee. What is time, really, if it can flow differently just a few feet away? We think of time as constant, a river with one direction, but on Maplewood Drive, it's more like a web, sticky, tangled, and unpredictable. Perhaps time isn't a force. Perhaps it's a mood, a suggestion, a compromise between realities. And on this street, the compromise is fraying. Here, next door doesn't just mean someone lives beside you. It means someone might be living in a different year entirely. Thoughts are invisible, or so we once believed. At UC Berkeley, inside a lab designed for cognitive mapping, something extraordinary occurred. It was 2015 when Dr. Michael Chen, a neuroscientist, noticed that the air shimmered faintly during deep concentration. Patterns emerged, floating shapes, then colors, then forms, geometric, organic, always shifting. He wasn't hallucinating. Others saw them too. The phenomenon was quickly dubbed the consciousness mirror. A room where thoughts took shape, not metaphorically, literally. Inside the lab, analytical thoughts manifested as crystalline lattices, sharp, angular, pulsing with logic. Creative ideas flowed in curves and colors, luminous and soft. Emotions created weather. Anger brought heat. Sadness dimmed the light. Joy rippled through the walls like music turned visible. At first it was unnerving, but soon it became the most coveted experiment in the cognitive sciences. Researchers realized they could see each other think. Ideas once trapped in language emerged in 3D space, coalescing like breath on glass. Complex theories hovered in the air, spinning in sync with brainwaves. Abstract concepts danced just inches from their creators. These were not projections. Instruments detected measurable mass, electromagnetic signatures, even gravitational influence. The thoughts had substance, ephemeral, but real. Dr. Chen's team built a taxonomy. Mathematical reasoning emitted hard-edged polyhedrons. Dreams formed slowly mutating structures of glass and smoke. Meditative states turned the room into a quiet ocean of blue light. Then came the group experiments. When two or more minds focused together, their thoughts fused. Collective concepts formed intricate constructs, interlocking patterns more complex than any single mind could produce alone. These structures remained even after the thinkers left, fading slowly over hours, like echoes in time. Was this quantum consciousness? Dimensional crossover? Scans revealed the lab intersected with a zone of altered space-time. Neural activity in subjects increased in bandwidth and coherence, as if another layer of cognitive space had opened. The room had become a bridge, linking thought and matter in perfect symmetry. Security protocols followed. Negative thought patterns caused jagged, hazardous forms, spikes that disrupted equipment or floated menacingly. Some researchers reported psychological exhaustion, as if their thoughts were drained into the space around them. Still, the implications were staggering. Education transformed. Abstract math became sculpture. Literature manifested as swirling tapestries. Therapy entered a new era. Patients could see their pain, then watch it shift as they processed it. But deeper questions emerged. Are thoughts truly internal? Or do they always echo into the world, just too subtly to notice? If a thought can have weight in the right conditions, what else have we been shaping with our minds without realizing it? Outside the lab, the air feels different now. People leave changed, not just intellectually, but emotionally. There's a hum in the silence. A sense that the space between people has always been filled with invisible architecture, ideas, fears, dreams, drifting like pollen. The consciousness mirror doesn't show who we are. It shows what we think, and makes us ask, if our thoughts become real in one room, how much of the world outside was built by minds that came before us? And how much are we building now with every passing thought? Reality is supposed to be linear, but in some places, the past and future bleed into the now. On a hiking trail in Olympic National Park, that truth comes undone. Locals call it Echo Forest. Officially, it's unnamed, just a forgotten path veiled in moss and mist. But for those who've walked it, the experience lingers like déjà vu stretched across days. Here, hikers encounter the future, not as a metaphor, as people, future versions of themselves, stepping from the fog to offer warnings, advice, or a simple look of recognition. These meetings aren't visions. They're physical, documented, witnessed by park rangers, families, scientists. Visitors shake hands with their older selves, share snacks, exchange memories that haven't happened yet. Photographer Lisa Rodriguez met her future self there, along with 5 strangers she didn't recognize. Her future self introduced them by name. Months later, Lisa joined a hiking group and met those same 5 people for the first time in the exact order under identical circumstances. The forest isn't haunted. It's converging. Geologists discovered the trail crosses an underground seam of crystal formations, natural structures that resonate with unusual electromagnetic frequencies. These crystals may act as tuning forks for time, bending it into loops and overlaps. Where time frays, futures seep in. Encounters are precise. They happen at specific coordinates during conditions of high humidity and geomagnetic flux. Most last 10 to 15 minutes. Some end with a word of warning, others with a promise, but all carry the same uncanny emotional weight. Recognition of something deeply, intimately familiar yet impossible. Dr. Sarah Kim's research found an accuracy rate of 94% for predicted events. People warned of injuries, weather, or career changes watched those events unfold exactly as described. A man who was told he'd meet the love of his life. Sometimes the dead never leave, not as spirits, but as alternate possibilities. The house on Maple Street in Salem, Oregon is quiet now, but the cameras don't lie. On certain nights, it fills with two families at once, the living and the not quite gone. We return here not to repeat ourselves, but to deepen the mystery. Robert and Susan Morrison died in 1987, yet their home life continues. They cook, they watch television, they laugh with their now-grown daughters, and sometimes they host visits from grandchildren, children born in a dimension where tragedy never claimed them. Parallel realities often sound like fiction, but the Jameson family, who now live in the same house, would disagree. Their home is a threshold. The security footage shows both families moving through the same rooms, separated by a veil neither can see or touch. But the evidence grows. The Morrisons age appropriately. They discuss events that never happened in their original timeline: technologies, elections, world events. Somehow they're absorbing information from our reality, adapting as though the lines between dimensions were porous. Audio captured by researchers includes conversations referencing smartphones, online shopping, even films released long after their reported deaths. The implications are staggering. This isn't a haunting. It's continuity, an unbroken thread from a world where a single car never crashed, where a life-altering moment never occurred. It raises a chilling idea. Trauma might act as a dimensional scar. When tragedy strikes with enough force, it doesn't just end lives, it fractures time. And sometimes the other path leaks through. Similar reports have emerged elsewhere, locations where families perished suddenly and inexplicably. The common denominator? Unexpected, violent endings. As though reality itself rebels against abrupt closure, opening cracks to reveal what might have been. The Jameson house is just the most documented. Footage comparisons show uncanny accuracy. Photos from surviving Morrison relatives match the apparitions exactly, aged appropriately, dressed in modern clothing, carrying on lives interrupted only in our version of events. They aren't ghosts. They are survivors in a parallel track of time, intersecting with ours in brief, unexplainable windows. And then there's the feeling, the one the Jamesons describe on the nights it happens. A warmth, a closeness, the sense of being seen by someone who isn't there, of sharing a home with the invisible. It's not fear, it's something softer. A melancholy awareness that another life is unfolding just beyond reach. That maybe, somewhere, your story didn't end the way it did here. That loss isn't final, it's fractional. Split not across space, but possibility. In this house, memory becomes motion. Grief becomes proof. And what we call death might be just a change in direction, not destination. So we ask again, if another version of you exists, unbroken, uninterrupted, does that make the life you live more real or less? Maybe the better question is this: what if all our lives are just different turns in the same road, glimpsed in moments when the fog lifts, revealing who we were, who we could be, and who we still are somewhere else? In Prague, the past walks through the present. In Seattle, buildings breathe. In Montana, gravity reverses its grip. But there's a deeper thread connecting them all, a truth we've been circling since the first unexplained flicker. Reality is not a single fabric. It's a weave, dense, layered, and increasingly frayed. Across decades and continents, dimensional bleeding incidents have accelerated. Once isolated, they now form a mosaic. future echoes, duplicate cities, living structures, emotional forces. None of them can be explained by conventional science, yet none can be denied. They point to a convergence. Physicists once believed in a closed universe, a single timeline governed by immutable laws, but that model is crumbling. These phenomena are not random. They're patterned, predictable. They follow rules, just not our rules. Something is leaking. And it's not just time or gravity or thought. It's possibility. In every case, the overlap is temporary but vivid. People meet versions of themselves. Cities become their own altars of what could have been. Forests sing with tomorrow's memory. Houses echo with footsteps from another life. And each event leaves something behind. Artifacts, witnesses, changes in biology, in behavior, in belief. One researcher described it best. It's as if the multiverse is breathing, and sometimes we inhale the air from another world. But the question that haunts us isn't how this is happening. It's why. Are these accidents? Or is something intentional occurring? A thinning of boundaries. A rethreading of reality to accommodate a coming shift. Indigenous traditions spoke of soft spots in the world, sacred places where the veil was always thinner. Modern science dismissed these as metaphor, but perhaps they were always maps, pointing toward pressure points in the weave of existence. And now those soft spots are spreading. Electromagnetic anomalies, atmospheric echoes, biological convergence, emotional architecture, temporal fragmentation. Each is a symptom. Each suggests the same thing. The separation between dimensions is not permanent. And maybe it never was. Perhaps consciousness, not matter, is the true anchor of reality. Perhaps we build the wall between worlds with our certainty. And now, that certainty is cracking. As the incidents grow, one thing becomes clear. We're not just observers of these leaks. We're participants. Every choice we make, every thought, fear, longing might ripple outward into other versions of ourselves, and when the veil thins, those versions ripple back. We're not experiencing random anomalies. We're experiencing reminders of the lives we didn't live, the paths we didn't take, the selves we almost became. And in that there's beauty, not fear, not finality, but a deep, aching reminder that our lives are more fluid, more connected, and more mysterious than we ever allowed ourselves to believe. We are, all of us, standing at a crossroads of reality. And sometimes, if you're quiet, if you listen carefully enough, you can hear footsteps approaching from a road just left of yours. A version of you returning to say, "It's still open, the door never closed." And maybe, just maybe, it never will. What binds these stories together is not just their strangeness, but their coherence. They echo across disciplines, across continents, across time. A house where two families live in overlapping timelines. A forest where tomorrow walks beside today. Cities resurrected from alternate histories. Emotions that sculpt matter. Probability bending like weather. Buildings learning how to feel. These aren't isolated anomalies. They're notes in a larger chord, resonances from dimensions brushing up against our own. And now, as we gather the threads, we arrive at a quiet, unsettling truth. Reality is not singular. It is a symphony of possibility. We live in one arrangement of it, but the others are playing too. Somewhere, a version of you never left your hometown. Somewhere, you became a poet. Somewhere, you never survived that accident. And somewhere, you were never born, but someone else was, with your smile, your laugh, your capacity for wonder. The fabric of existence isn't stitched in certainty. It's quilted from countless realities, momentarily stable, always shifting. And now, we are beginning to see the seams. The increase in dimensional bleed-throughs may not be accidental. Perhaps it is a natural evolution. As our instruments sharpen, our consciousness expands, and our minds open to what science once ignored. we begin to perceive what was always there. Other worlds, other laws, other versions of us. Maybe we were never meant to live in isolation. Maybe reality, like the cosmos, was always meant to be shared, not just by neighbors, but by parallel selves, by cities that made different choices, by forests that remember the future, by matter that listens when we speak not with words, but with feelings. This is not a warning, it's an invitation to imagine more deeply, to see more widely, to feel more honestly. Because if our emotions shape space and our thoughts sculpt form, then reality is not just a place we occupy, it is something we co-create. So where does this leave us? With a choice. We can ignore the anomalies, write them off as errors, close our eyes, and hope the fabric stays stitched. Or we can open the door wider. We can listen when time whispers back. We can follow the trail that leads into memory, into mystery, into meaning. And when we see the shadow of another world flicker in the corner of our vision, we don't have to be afraid. Because what these stories teach us, above all else, is this. We are not alone, not in space, not in time, not even in ourselves. We are echoes. We are branches. We are possibilities walking in parallel. And every so often the veil lifts, not to scare us, but to remind us that reality is richer, kinder, and more alive than we ever imagined. The universe is not broken. It's just more open than we thought, and we are only beginning to step through.